Alright, so we're going to pick up our third section now with the class Amphibia. So kind of going back and recapping the classes we've seen so far. We have the Myxini, Cephalospidomorphi, Chondrichthyes, Actinopterygii, and Sarcopterygii. And now we're moving into the class Amphibia. Now, with this group, we're actually going to go one more level more specific in terms of taxonomy and deal with three different orders of amphibians. Before we do that, we need to talk about some basic characteristics. So the class Amphibia, turns out, is the next to smallest main group of vertebrates, second only to the mammals when it comes to these smallest groups of vertebrates. There are fewer mammals than there are amphibians, but more reptiles, birds, and fishes than there are amphibians. So we're about 5,600 species now here with the amphibians. They are significant in that they are the link to the aquatic environment and the terrestrial environment. So they are the first vertebrates to actually walk on land. So the earliest of these creatures would have been fishes, very similar to today's what are referred to as lungfishes. They're able to actually get out of the water, walk around on land for a few hours, maybe a couple of days, and then crawl back into the water. They actually had some very primitive lungs which are able to breathe air, albeit for relatively short periods of time, but you can imagine as those animals came out of the water and could survive longer and longer on land where there really weren't any organisms as big as them, that would have been a big benefit to them in terms of survival. So eventually, the amphibians were able to get out of the water and live independent of it, almost, except for reproduction, and live on land. So they have to go back to the water for reproduction, but aside from that, they can live on the terrestrial type environment. Now, that being said, most amphibians aren't going to do real well in very, very dry environments. They need to have at least some humidity, if not some outright water around them. But they're able to live, for the most part, on land. So these are primarily tetrapods, meaning they have four legs. Most of them are going to be oviparous, with one exception. One of the orders is going to be more of an ovoviviparous group, and sometimes even viviparous. But for frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, those kinds of things, they are all going to be oviparous. So because they're aquatic, they're going to have external fertilization. And again, the one group that is not oviparous is also an exception here. They do internal fertilization, but everybody else in the amphibian world goes through external fertilization, often with what these two red-eyed tree frogs are doing, a behavior called amplexus. And so what's going on here is the male is actually grasping the female by the shoulders, waiting for her to produce her eggs, and then he fertilizes them, and they are then just left in the water to kind of fend for themselves. The covering over the eggs that you find, if you've ever found frog eggs or toad eggs in a body of water, a pond or a puddle even for that matter, they're very slimy, but they're also not very good at maintaining moisture. So if you take those eggs out of water, very quickly they dry out and they die. Whereas other animals, as we're going to see, the reptiles and everybody beyond them, they are able to maintain an egg on dry land for various reasons, as we'll see. One of the other hallmarks of the amphibians is the fact that they have very moist glandular skin, and it turns out that's actually really important for them because they do a lot of their breathing actually through their skin. The amphibians do not have very advanced lungs. Their lungs are basically a side pouch to their gut, so they're not super advanced, they're not super efficient, and so to kind of make up the difference when it comes to their gas exchange needs, they actually breathe through their skin. They have cutaneous respiration, and as we've seen before, if you have a respiratory surface that is dry, gas exchange stops, right? So since these animals breathe through their skin, they cannot have dry skin. Otherwise, their breathing through the skin stops, and they're not able to persist. So they actually do a fairly substantial amount of the breathing through their skin. Amphibians have a three-chambered heart, and so if you're at all familiar with the structure of a mammalian heart or a human heart, a couple of these terms might sound kind of familiar to you. The amphibian three-chambered heart is made up of two atria and one ventricle. All right, so three chambers total, whereas the fish heart technically only has one atrium and one ventricle. So a two-chambered heart for them. Amphibians have a three-chambered heart. So the amphibians are the ones that actually invented that double loop circulatory system that we talked about back in the last section. They actually have the section or system that takes blood from the heart to the lungs and skin, and another segment or system that takes blood from the heart to the rest of the body. All right, so other features of the amphibians: legs, obviously very important, keeping the body up off the ground. Lungs, relatively primitive, and they do not have a diaphragm. So diaphragm is really important for animals that breathe through what's called negative pressure breathing, where they actually pull air into their lungs. Amphibians don't have a diaphragm, so they actually have to push air into their lungs, essentially force air down by swallowing it to get air into the lungs. So not a very efficient means of doing that. If you ever watch an amphibian for any amount of time, you notice how fast it's breathing, and that's because they're not getting that much air with each breath, and they're also supplementing through their skin, but they look like they just ran a sprint because they're breathing so fast, even though they may not have moved for several hours. That's just how they breathe, kind of at a basic background level. We talked about the pulmonary circuit, which is kind of a new thing to the amphibians and everybody else beyond them evolutionarily. Blood between the heart and lungs versus blood between the heart and systemic circulation. And then finally, we have that three-chambered heart. Depending on which group of amphibians you look at, that chambered heart can be partially divided in the ventricle, although in some it's more or less one relatively open space. All right, so we talked about some of these things. Yeah, so this little animal here is called a red-spotted newt. These are indigenous to this part of the world. This picture here is actually of a juvenile, so bright orange with kind of bright red or bright pink spots. This is another really good example of the aposematic coloration we talked about several lectures ago, where it's a type of warning coloration where a potential prey item will advertise its defenses to the potential predators to prevent them from attacking it. This actually is a juvenile called a red eft, EFT. They eventually mature into more of like a, the back is more of like an olive color, the belly is kind of a cream color, and they actually maintain those red spots to help advertise their toxic nature to their predators. There are a few things that can eat these. There's a couple species of snakes that can eat red-spotted newts, but even they pay the price because when they consume one, they actually are paralyzed for several hours due to the toxin present in the amphibian's skin. And of course, when the snake is paralyzed, it's kind of a sitting duck for any sort of potential predators that might feed on the snake, whether it's a hawk or whatever. The snake is more or less defenseless while it kind of deals with the poison from its prey. All amphibians have poisonous skin. Doesn't matter if it's a frog in your backyard or a toad in your backyard or a salamander under your woodpile or something you find in the woods. All amphibians have poisonous skin. Part of that secretion, like I said before, is for breathing, but the other part obviously is for defense. That being said, there's really no danger in handling any of them, even those that are fairly well known for their toxicity, like the poison arrow frogs or poison dart frogs. Even those you can handle all day long, and as long as you don't try to eat one, they're not going to hurt you. The poison actually has to go through your GI tract before it becomes a problem, and if you just handle them, you can have all the poison on your skin as you can find, and it's not going to hurt you. So kind of something to bear in mind there, I guess. Once again, we're not going to kind of cover these transitional forms, Ichthyostega, Tiktaalik, two other transitional forms, but we are going to move into the three amphibian groups. So just to kind of back up here quickly and talk about the taxonomy as we've seen it so far, we are still in the phylum Chordata, we're still in the subphylum Vertebrata, we're in the class Amphibia, and now we're going to deal with three amphibian orders. So the Anura, Chordata, and Apoda. And we can actually talk about what those names mean. They actually are very meaningful. Anura means tailless, Chordata means tail, and Apoda means legless. All right, so that kind of gives you a little bit of a clue about which one of these groups does what. The Anurans are frogs and toads, never have a tail in the adult form, although juveniles, tadpoles obviously have a tail, but when the adult form, they lose that through the process of metamorphosis. The Chordata are salamanders and other things like that red-spotted newt I showed you a couple of slides ago. And the Apoda are ones that are not present in this part of the world, and actually you have to travel a pretty far distance to find them. They're present in like South America, Central America sometimes. They are legless amphibians, and they actually have some very, what to us might seem bizarre kinds of traits they use to kind of make it through their day-to-day lives. So for the frogs and toads, kind of talking about how to tell them apart, we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail, obviously. You'd have to take a herpetology class to learn more about very specific groups of frogs, toads, salamanders, apodans, or reptiles for that matter. But just kind of like a quick overview of the two groups. Frogs generally have a much smoother and moister skin than toads do, and they typically have longer hind legs. So if you look at an animal and it has really, really long, kind of awkward looking back legs and kind of short, stubby front legs, it's a frog. And its skin's going to be glandular. Doesn't matter if it has warts on its back or what people call warts. They're not really warts, they're glands. Frogs can have those too, but if they have those really big hind legs and that really moist skin, then chances are it's going to be a frog. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a toad, they're going to have a bumpier, drier skin. They're going to have shorter, stubbier legs. The hind legs are basically the same length as the front legs. Again, they don't have warts, but they do have a lot of glands, and those glands are for the secretion of essentially poison, but also that moist outer covering to allow them to breathe through their skin. Since they live in kind of drier environments than frogs do, toads tend to have a more glandular, bumpier skin. All right, so that's kind of a feature you can use in solve apart as well. But a surefire way to tell a frog from a toad is to pick it up. And there's a very, very particular behavior you can observe if you pick up what is a frog or a toad, and a neuron in general. If it urinates, it's a toad. If it doesn't, it's a frog. And that is almost a surefire way to tell the two apart. Now, the legs are a pretty obvious difference as well, but if you pick it up and it starts leaking all over you, you got a toad on your hands. Probably urine on your hands too, but frogs don't typically do that. They're much more inclined to conserve their water than try to use it as a defensive mechanism. All right, so both of these two groups, like all amphibians, have to live near water. They both have a tadpole stage. They both go through metamorphosis, so we're dealing with a type of indirect development here, where the tadpole form and the adult frog/toad form look very, very different. The other two groups of Chordata and Apoda go through direct development, so they actually do not have a metamorphosis change from a tadpole to an adult type stage. Now, the toads, currently classified, again, this is one of those situations we keep seeing this bullet point throughout the slide saying not a monophyletic group. The reason I say that is because there are very likely some things that are currently classified as frogs that are actually toads, and maybe even vice versa as well. So we're still working on the taxonomy of these things, and by no means is it completely 100% settled. Again, eggs have to be in water. They're not able to withstand drying out. And again, these have external fertilization, which works in the water, but not so much on land. All right, so a couple of different kind of interesting amphibians here, anurans. Top left picture is called a cane toad. Cane toads are very famous. First off, they're very big, as anurans go. They're maybe the size of a football. And these guys were actually introduced into Australia many decades ago with the idea that they would be able to control sugarcane beetles in sugarcane plantations in Australia, right? Because these toads do eat sugarcane beetles in other parts of the world. People thought, okay, if we take them to Australia, release them, that's going to help us control one of the big pests on this very important commercial crop, sugarcane. Well, it turns out that when they transplanted the toads to Australia, the toads didn't eat the cane beetles, and instead they started feeding on native insect fauna. And so that became a very, very big, more or less ecological disaster, because now the cane toads are everywhere. They did really, really well in Australia, and they more or less wiped out lots and lots and lots of species of insects and other arthropods because they have a very, very big appetite. So just kind of like a quick lesson in what happens when humans try to manipulate the environment by introducing things or removing things. It almost never works. It almost always has some sort of unintended consequence that makes it a flop, basically. Now, the bottom left picture and the picture on the right are poison dart frogs. And so they're famous, number one, for their aposematic coloration. All of them are very, very bright colored, almost like somebody painted them with some sort of psychedelic coloration here. But these are used by indigenous tribes in South America primarily. That's where they're found. This family is called the dendrobatid frogs. You don't really need to know that, but they're poison dart frogs, and they're known for, like I said, tribes of people that are using their toxic secretions as a way to subdue their prey. So people in tribes would actually catch these poison dart frogs. They're completely docile. They have no fear of humans whatsoever. They have no fear of anything whatsoever because nothing preys on them. And so humans can walk up, they can pluck them off of a tree, and they take them home and keep them kind of like as pets, but in a more sort of utilitarian way, because when they go out hunting, these people, they'll take their blowgun darts or arrows, rub them over the skin of the poison dart frog, and then go hunting. And so what will happen is if they shoot, say, a monkey in a tree, primate in a tree, and that kind of thing, if that poison dart has that secretion on it, it will actually more or less instantaneously kill that primate, which will then fall out of the trees. People pick it up and they take it home and they eat, right? So if you shot the primate without the poison, very likely the primate would run away through the tree tops. You'd never see it again. It may or may not even die, and it would be a really hard way to make a living. With these frogs, their skin secretions are a very effective way to capture prey that are otherwise kind of hard to find. Now, you might wonder, if you think about this for any amount of time at all, what happens then when the people go home and eat that monkey, right? Don't the monkeys have that poison in their system? And if the people eat it, isn't that going to cause harm to them as well? It turns out no, because the poison is actually a protein, and when people cook the prey that were killed with the poison dart frog's venom poison, it neutralizes the protein, denatures the protein, and at that point, it's no longer harmful. And so they're able to consume the meat without any worry at all. They can handle the frogs, like I said, with no worry at all. As long as they don't eat them, there's absolutely no danger in having them around. Interestingly, too, you can buy poison dart frogs, and I by no means advocate doing this ever for anyone, because a lot of them are captured from the wild, and many of them that are captured die on the way to market, and it's a really not at all sustainable thing to do. But poison dart frogs, if they're not able to feed on their natural diet, lose their toxicity, and they actually become completely harmless at that point if they don't have a particular diet that will give them the materials they need to build those toxic proteins. The Chordata are the salamanders, and also newts, so long bodies, long tails, smooth glandular skin, typically in damp places. Some of them are even called mole salamanders because they live below ground for the vast majority of their lives. For them, they actually are also lungless salamanders, so unless they're below ground where it's cool and damp, they actually dry out pretty fast and die. A lot of salamanders like to live along creeks, sometimes even in the creek, but at the very least under rocks and logs and things like that, even in the forest floor. They have internal fertilization on land, where they use what's called a spermatophore. Spermatophore is basically a packet of sperm that's placed on the ground. Females then take it into their reproductive tract and fertilize their eggs internally. So the amphibians do not have, this group of amphibians does not have external fertilization. They're actually internal, because they live on more of a dry land type situation than the anurans do. And again, like I mentioned before, these guys go through direct development. The apodans are the Sicilians, the legless group of amphibians. They are, like I said, tropical. They are fossorial, which means they live below ground. They are legless, and they are very well adapted to a subterranean lifestyle with very small eyes, because let's face it, if you live below ground, having great eyesight probably is not a priority. And they also have jaws with teeth. Now, if you think about other amphibians like frogs, toads, and salamanders, they actually don't have teeth, but this group does. And so a lot of what they consume below ground are things like annelids, arthropods, and they have teeth to actually subdue those prey. This group also has internal fertilization, and typically, like I mentioned earlier, they are an ovoviviparous group. They can be viviparous as well, but they have a very unusual sort of strategy when it comes time for the offspring to emerge from the female's reproductive tract, especially for those that are ovoviviparous. Because the ovoviviparous species do not have a direct connection to the female's reproductive tract, what they do when they hatch inside the female's uterus is they actually begin to chew on the uterine lining. And that stimulates a secretion to be released, which then feeds the young Sicilian until they're able to emerge from the uterus and start fending for themselves. So they use those teeth to actually chew on the mother's uterus until they're able to emerge. And at that point, the female actually regrows that uterine lining and recovers to the point where she could actually have another brood of offspring. So very different kind of a lifestyle compared to what we're thinking about, but of course for them it's normal. You got to kind of take things with a grain of salt. When you see something that's very unusual to you, it doesn't mean that it's unusual to them. And if they had the ability to perceive us as humans, they might think we do some fairly odd things as well. So just because we don't do the things the same way they do doesn't mean they're the weird ones, because sometimes we are. All right, a few other amphibians here. The top left and bottom right pictures are called hellbenders. They are the largest salamander species in the world. You can find these actually not too far from here. The American hellbender is the second largest species of salamander in the world. There's also a Chinese version of this. It's a little bit bigger, but they can be upwards of 2 or 3 feet, anyway, a few pounds. Pretty big salamander. Historically were persecuted for completely bogus reasons. People thought they ate fish, and people thought they would actually kill people, and there's ridiculous things, myths and stories told about hellbenders, so much so that people actually go out and kill them intentionally, just basically to get rid of them for no reason. But they're completely harmless. They live under rocks. They feed on crayfish. They are nature's shut-in. Like, they find a rock they like, and they will live under it for their entire life, which for some of these things can be a few decades. They live under that rock, and they feed on crayfish, and that's really all they do. Also good indicators of water quality, because they need some very, very clean water to exist, as do their food, the crayfish. The top right picture is a spotted salamander, which are also native around here, and the bottom left picture is called an axolotl, which is an aquatic salamander, which has external gills and a few other things that are unique to that particular few species of axes. So from there, we're going to pick up our 4th section on the vertebrates, and we're going to talk about which came first, the chicken or the egg. And so we'll ruin that question for you as soon as we pick up that next section.